Why sanctions of the US to China are worthless. China has been developing strategies to counter the effectiveness of US sanctions, posing a significant challenge to the United States. If China becomes immune to sanctions, it could gain immense influence and potentially lead to a shift in global power favoring authoritarian rule and human rights suppression. Sanctions, specifically economic sanctions, are measures taken by governments to restrict a foreign entity's business activities. They aim to harm the target or compel them to change their behavior. However, China has found ways to circumvent and mitigate the impact of these sanctions. China's ability to withstand US sanctions can be attributed to two primary factors. First, China has integrated itself into the global economy, making it less reliant on any specific country or region. While the US remains its largest trade partner, China has diversified its economic ties worldwide. Sanctioning China comprehensively would harm both economies, but China's extensive network of trade partners, particularly in Asia, would make it challenging for the US to garner support for harsh sanctions. China's economic influence extends to regions such as Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, where governments fear the repercussions of upsetting China. The second factor is China's introduction of anti-sanction laws in response to US and EU sanctions. These laws deter sanctions specifically targeting Chinese companies. They empower China to impose counter-sanctions on individuals or entities involved in designing or implementing sanctions against China. This includes visa denials, asset seizures, and blocking commercial transactions. Such laws can create significant consequences for corporations doing business with or in China, causing politicians and executives to approach sanctions cautiously or oppose them to protect their interests. China understands that threatening the profits of US businesses can influence political decisions. China's newfound economic might and counter-sanction laws have given it the means to resist US sanctions. Its ability to retaliate against American companies or influence their actions has further complicated the effectiveness of sanctions. This warns the US that China will no longer tolerate such treatment as it becomes increasingly powerful. China has intentionally used vague language in its laws to threaten foreign businesses, causing concern for companies heavily reliant on China. If China retaliates against US businesses due to sanctions, it could have disastrous consequences for those companies in the US economy. The authoritarian nature of China's government allows it to change or modify laws quickly, making it easier for China to deal with foreign pressure and sanctions. This dynamic makes it challenging for US sanctions to be effective when the rules in China are constantly changing. Additionally, China's been working to become less reliant on the US and has shifted its focus to hardware production, making it less susceptible to sanctions. China's adoption of digital currency also enables it to bypass US banking sanctions. China has learned from past experiences, particularly studying the sanctions imposed on Russia, and has prepared itself to mitigate the effects of future sanctions. Understanding the sanctioning process and the sanctions already in place is essential to grasp how China combats and circumvents US sanctions. However, while targeted sanctions are considered most effective, sanctions do not always achieve their desired outcomes. The effectiveness of sanctions can vary widely, and what works against any one country might not work against another. Policymakers must consider several factors when enacting sanctions. There's no guarantee that sanctions will change the behavior of a targeted entity, and they often have short-term consequences unless they are highly targeted and aggressive. China, for instance, is currently less worried about US sanctions and is instead leveraging its economic capabilities to make other nations reliant on them while weakening countries through gray zone tactics. China is playing a strategic long-term game, using economic influence and offering enticing trade deals to expand its global reach. The US's policies and actions may push countries towards closer ties with China if they perceive better opportunities for growth and development. China's growing influence can be seen in regions like Latin America and Africa, where indebtedness to China has given Beijing significant control over local economies and policies. Examining the sanctions the US has placed on China reveals that they have had very limited impact. For example, the sanctions on Huawei did not significantly hinder the company's operations or market presence. Some sanctions, such as those related to currency manipulation, may have led to short-term behavior changes, but it remains unclear if China has truly altered its practices. Sanctions related to human rights abuses against the Uyghur population have had little effect in stopping the ongoing genocide. Overall, US sanctions are unlikely to cripple the Chinese economy or force meaningful changes in Beijing's behavior in the near future. China's economic growth continues, and it may surpass the US in GDP by 2035 or even 2060. The efficacy of sanctions against China is uncertain, and policymakers should consider alternative strategies to address China's actions and influence. Sanctions imposed by the US on China have had limited effectiveness in changing China's behavior or curbing its actions. The sanctions on Hong Kong officials, Chinese military companies, and other entities have not prevented the suppression of free speech or human rights violations. While some sanctions, such as those on Huawei, have had an impact, China has been adapting by creating its own semiconductors. China's dominance in global trade and its expanding economic influence make it difficult for sanctions to have a significant impact. Many countries rely on trade with China and are unwilling to risk their economies by supporting US sanctions. China's trade deficits with certain nations also provide opportunities for increased imports and influence. The US faces challenges in sanctioning China without harming its own economy and allies. Aggressive actions needed to change China's behavior through sanctions could lead to global economic turmoil. China has been preparing to withstand future sanctions by becoming more self-sufficient and controlling global economic norms. Sanctions alone may not be enough to control China or change its behavior. Diplomacy and discussions between the two nations could lead to progress. The military confrontation would be highly undesirable for both parties. In the future, it is likely that the US will continue issuing sanctions with limited impact, and China will respond with its own measures. The interconnectedness of both economies makes effective sanctions difficult, as a collapse in either economy would have severe global consequences.